December 16, 1944, began with a sound that instantly told American troops something was wrong. The artillery falling around Mona, Germany wasn't hitting the ground the way shells normally did. Instead, they were bursting above the trees, shredding the air with steel fragments that rained down on German infantry advancing through the snow. Soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front froze in confusion because none of their experience prepared them for explosions that ignored foxholes, trenches, or tree cover. They were being hit by a weapon they didn't know existed. The man responsible for unleashing it, Colonel Oscar Axelson, had just broken one of the strictest rules in the Allied arsenal. Without waiting for permission, he ordered his artillery crews to load the top-secret shells kept under lock and key. These shells held miniature radar systems so advanced for their time that even touching one without authorization could result in punishment. No one was supposed to fire them at ground troops. But with the 38th Cavalry Squadron collapsing under a sudden German offensive, Axelson chose to ignore protocol and save the position. That decision instantly multiplied the power of American artillery. Instead of exploding harmlessly into the frozen soil, each shell detonated at the perfect height to cut down anything beneath it. The Germans attacking Mona had no way of understanding that they'd just walked into the first large-scale battlefield use of a technology so advanced that most Allied soldiers didn't know it existed. Hitler's Ardennes Offensive had begun hours earlier with confidence. 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 guns were thrown into a surprise attack designed to break the Allied line and recover lost ground. American intelligence had missed nearly all signs of it, leaving the front line manned by exhausted veterans and inexperienced replacements. For a brief moment, everything seemed to favor Hitler's last gamble. But where the German plan relied on speed, Axelson's decision introduced something far more decisive: scientific advantage. The proximity fuses didn't care about fog, forest, camouflage, or the usual tricks that saved men from artillery. They simply sensed nearby objects and detonated at the deadliest moment. American shells that once needed careful timing now found their own mark. German infantry advancing in tight formations saw entire groups vanish under air bursts they could neither anticipate nor escape. Inside, each fuse was packed a level of engineering that had taken thousands of physicists and technicians years to perfect. Tiny vacuum tubes, barely larger than a fingertip, had been redesigned to survive the crushing acceleration of being fired from a cannon. These fuses were so sensitive and complex that their development required secrecy rivaling the Manhattan Project. Workers who built them weren't even told what the devices were used for. But by late 1944, American factories were producing them in massive quantities, each one turning a single artillery shell into a wide-area airburst weapon. On that morning in Mona, this scientific achievement met battlefield necessity. While Axelson's unauthorized use technically violated orders, the effect was so immediate and overwhelming that higher command quickly realized they were witnessing something that could shift the momentum of the entire Ardennes battle. German troops, already fighting in freezing cold with dwindling supplies, suddenly faced artillery that behaved like an intelligent predator, finding them regardless of cover, time of day, or weather. As the German assault faltered under these unexpected explosions, word began spreading through American lines that something new had entered the battlefield. No one yet understood the full implications, but the reality was clear. Proximity fuses had begun rewriting the rules of the Ardennes fight. And for the German soldiers caught beneath that rain of steel, the offensive that had begun with such confidence now felt like it had collided with an invisible weapon far beyond anything they were prepared to face. The days that followed confirmed what began at Mona. The German offensive had run headfirst into a weapon they had no defense against. When word of Axelson's results reached headquarters, the reaction shifted almost instantly from anger to urgency. Eisenhower himself was briefed on the situation and realized that, with the German attack spreading across the entire Ardennes line, this new fuse could be the difference between holding ground and complete collapse. By December 21st, the restriction was lifted. Every artillery unit in the region was ordered to begin using proximity fuses, turning the entire Ardennes forest into a place where simply being outdoors became a deadly gamble for German troops. The change was immediate. Artillery that once needed clear skies and accurate spotting now functioned like a self-guided system. The shells didn't need to land near targets, they simply needed to fly above them. And because the fuses detonated automatically at the right height, they bypassed every defensive tactic German soldiers had learned since the beginning of the war. Spread out or grouped together, hidden or in the open, advancing or digging in, it didn't matter. The shells burst overhead and showered fragments downward with such precision that movement itself became dangerous. Bastogne became the clearest demonstration of how much the battlefield had changed. Surrounded by German forces and low on supplies, the 101st Airborne would normally have been overwhelmed. But with proximity fuses in the hands of their supporting artillery, every German attempt to close the ring on the town was broken apart before infantry even reached American lines. Soldiers advancing across snowy fields found themselves under sudden explosions that seemed to know exactly where they were. Whole platoons were cut down in seconds, not by direct hits, but by perfectly timed airbursts that reached over ridges or spread deadly shrapnel through the tree lines they relied on for cover. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit fighting nearby, used their 155mm guns with such effect that German troops later admitted their attacks dissolved before they even got close. The size of the fragments, the height of the bursts, and the pattern of the explosions created a killing field no defensive skill could overcome. German troops who usually trusted the forest for concealment found that the trees now worked against them. When a proximity-fused shell broke apart overhead, it not only sent steel in every direction but also shattered branches into fast, deadly splinters. The very environment the Germans counted on became part of the weapon. Across the Ardennes, this same pattern repeated in different forms. Units trying to move along trails or roads discovered they no longer had nighttime or fog as cover. Shells fired at rough coordinates burst overhead and found their mark, even without direct observation. Supply columns stopped moving, replacements stalled, assault groups broke apart before they could coordinate. Soldiers trained to use timing and terrain to avoid artillery now faced a threat that followed them everywhere. The technical simplicity of the fuse disguised the sophistication behind it. A tiny radar transmitter inside each shell sent out continuous pulses, measuring changes in reflected signals. When those reflections intensified, meaning the shell was directly above something, it detonated at the precise height needed for maximum range and fragmentation. What had once required expert observers and elaborate coordination was now automated inside a device no larger than a coffee can. The Ardennes was the first place where this technology was used against ground troops on a large scale, and the psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical damage. German units accustomed to predictable artillery began refusing orders, unable to process how shells could burst above them without any visible observers. They moved from fear to paralysis because no tactic seemed to work. Even elite formations, including SS units known for their discipline and aggression, cracked under this invisible threat. Survivors later described the bombardments as unnatural, as if the shells were hunting them personally. As reports flowed back to American headquarters, commanders realized they were witnessing more than improved artillery. They were watching a scientific breakthrough shift the balance of the entire winter campaign. The fuse didn't just add firepower. It erased the traditional advantages of the defender and turned every inch of ground in the Ardennes into a place where the air itself could become lethal at any moment. The most chilling demonstration of this new technology came on Christmas night along the Sauer River. A German battalion, believing darkness and fog would protect their crossing, moved quietly across the partially frozen water. Under normal circumstances, they would have slipped through before American artillery could adjust fire. But proximity fuses didn't need perfect calculations or clear skies. When the first shells burst directly over the river, German soldiers suddenly found themselves trapped between ice, water, and explosions that seemed to hover precisely where they were most exposed. When the firing stopped, more than 700 bodies were counted. It was one of the only times in the war that an entire battalion was wiped out with such brutal efficiency. Patton, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote with stunned honesty that he had never seen a weapon so devastating. The forests, once the greatest natural ally of German troops, became part of the destruction. Soldiers who took cover under branches or dug into roots discovered that the explosions above them shattered trees as violently as they shredded men. Splinters, as long as rifles, tore through the air at lethal speed. Whole squads disappeared without ever seeing an American soldier. Even veterans who had survived the Eastern Front admitted they had never encountered anything like it. There was no clever tactic, no trick of timing, no amount of bravery that could protect them. The only real defense was distance, and in the tight forests of the Ardennes, distance was impossible. What made the impact even more crushing was that the Germans had once been ahead in this very field. Before the war, their engineers had nearly created their own version of the proximity fuse, abandoning the project only because Hitler demanded quick turnaround weapons. So when German experts examined captured shells during the Bulge and saw miniature vacuum tubes inside, they dismissed them as decoys or absurd failures. They believed no tube could survive the force of being fired from a cannon. They couldn't accept what had already become reality, that American scientists had solved the problem the Germans had walked away from. This failure of imagination cost them dearly. Even Germany's elite troops faltered. Otto Skorzeny's commandos, men known for daring missions, deception, and psychological warfare, attempted to capture the town of Malmedy while disguised as American soldiers. Instead, they were caught in proximity-fused barrages that tore their formations apart. Their disguises, which were supposed to give them advantage, only left them more exposed as the shells burst overhead with unerring precision. Some survivors reportedly broke and ran toward American lines, seeking surrender or death just to escape the bombardment. These were Hitler's best-trained special forces, reduced to panic by a weapon they couldn't comprehend. Meanwhile, American factories continued producing fuses at a pace that mirrored the urgency of the front. More than 100 companies across the United States turned their assembly lines into precision electronics plants. Women filled the workforce, soldering microscopic connections they never knew would decide battles. Quality control was so strict that even the slightest flaw meant a component was thrown away. Workers were never told what their devices actually did, only that the war depended on them. By late 1944, the United States was producing one fuse every 2 seconds, an industrial feat almost as remarkable as the weapon itself. For American commanders, especially Patton, the fuse became a tool that reshaped how artillery could be used. No longer limited by terrain or visibility, gunners began using tactics that would have been impossible before. They fired coordinated barrages timed to detonate at the exact same moment, turning whole hillsides into lethal airbursts. German counterattacks dissolved before they began. Patton later wrote that this single invention changed the entire course of the winter campaign, allowing his army to push north fast enough to relieve Bastogne and prevent the Germans from isolating the town permanently. And while proximity fuses dominated the ground battle, they also reshaped the skies. When the Luftwaffe launched its last major air operation on New Year's Day, hundreds of German planes flew into anti-aircraft fire powered by the same technology. More than half were destroyed before they could escape. German pilots said it felt as though the sky itself was exploding around them, that no evasive maneuver could shake the shells bursting precisely at their altitude. The Luftwaffe never recovered from that single day of losses. Across both land and air, the story was the same. A small radar device had turned American artillery into one of the deadliest forces of the war, breaking German attacks, crushing morale, and rewriting the balance of power across the entire Ardennes. By early January, the scale of what proximity fuses had accomplished could no longer be hidden. Even the American press began hinting at a new type of artillery shell, although the exact nature of the technology remained secret. German intelligence, now desperate to understand why their best units had been stopped cold, finally recognized the truth. Reports from the front described shells that behaved nothing like time fuses or impact rounds. They detonated at heights too perfect to be coincidence, in patterns too deadly to ignore, but knowing the weapon existed did nothing to slow its effect. There was no countermeasure, no shield, no tactic that made any difference. By the time their analysts confirmed the American advantage, tens of thousands of German soldiers had already fallen under airburst fire. The strategic impact was enormous. In the Ardennes, where the Germans had committed their last major reserves, tanks, experienced officers, elite infantry, the proximity fuse stripped away every advantage they hoped terrain would give them. They couldn't hide in forests. They couldn't advance under fog. They couldn't concentrate forces for breakthrough. Every attempt to move forward met a wall of shells that exploded in mid-air with mechanical consistency. What remained of German momentum collapsed into scattered, confused units acting without coordination. The testimony of German commanders after the war reveals just how deeply this shook them. Von Rundstedt admitted openly that the Americans had mastered a form of artillery fire beyond anything the German army had imagined. Other officers described the barrages as invisible minefields in the sky, destroying formations before they had the chance to fight. Even in the SS divisions, units known for discipline and fanatical resolve, morale crumbled. Men refused orders. Attacks stalled. Entire units broke apart simply from the fear of what the next barrage might bring. The numbers confirmed their worst fears. During the Bulge, roughly 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired. They caused an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, a staggering percentage of total losses. And they did so while reducing the need for massive ammunition expenditure. A single proximity-fused shell could do the job of many conventional rounds, making American firepower feel almost limitless. Even in poor weather, even at night, even when observers could see nothing, artillery remained lethal. The Germans had never faced a weapon that erased so many of their time-tested principles at once. Behind the scenes, American scientists and workers paid their own price. The development program pushed engineers to physical and mental limits. Factories worked around the clock, with women assembling delicate components under extreme pressure. Accidents were hushed up. Workers suffered injuries and exhaustion without knowing what they were risking their health for. They simply knew America needed whatever they were building. Only after the war would many discover that their hands had produced one of the most influential weapons of the century. The moral weight of the proximity fuse is difficult to separate from its strategic necessity. The Battle of the Bulge cost thousands of American lives. Without this technology, the Ardennes counter-offensive might have lasted far longer. The Germans might have taken Bastogne. The Allies might have been pushed back miles, altering the timing of operations across the Western Front. Every delay would have allowed more deportations, more executions, more suffering in the concentration camps scattered across Nazi-occupied Europe. In a grim calculus, the proximity fuse may have shortened the war by weeks or months, time that translated into lives saved elsewhere. As German forces struggled to hold ground, the harsh winter weather offered no refuge. Before proximity fuses, blizzards and fog meant safety. Aircraft couldn't fly, spotters couldn't see, but during the Bulge, American artillery kept firing with deadly accuracy despite zero visibility. German soldiers discovered that night marches which once offered protection now led them into sudden, catastrophic ambush by shells that didn't need to see them to find them. In a war filled with technological leaps, from jet aircraft to rocket weapons to code breaking, the proximity fuse stood apart because its impact was immediate, unmistakable, and brutally personal. It didn't change the war from afar. It changed the battlefield at ground level, in the forests and river valleys, where soldiers fought and died. It turned the sky into a weapon, and stripped the enemy of the ability to hide, maneuver, or predict where death would come from. By the beginning of 1945, the Germans realized they were facing not just American soldiers, but American science, American industry, and American logistics fused into a single device that dominated the battlefield. Their final offensive had collided with a weapon they neither expected nor understood, and the consequences were irreversible. By late January, the German offensive had collapsed completely. What began as Hitler's final gamble to split the Allied armies ended in retreat, exhaustion, and the realization that Germany had reached the end of its strength. The Battle of the Bulge consumed nearly all remaining reserves: fuel, ammunition, armored vehicles, experienced officers, and left the German army incapable of mounting another large-scale attack. And woven through every phase of this collapse was the proximity fuse, a weapon that magnified American artillery into something Germany could neither match nor counter. The final casualty reports were brutal. Germany lost around 100,000 men in the Ardennes, while American losses totaled about 75,000, heavy but far less catastrophic than they would have been without the fuse. General Eisenhower later admitted that if Germany had possessed proximity fuses during D-Day, the Allied landings might have failed entirely. Such was the weapon's impact. It wasn't merely an improvement in firepower, it was a shift in the nature of artillery itself. German soldiers who survived described the experience as facing a weapon that seemed alive. Shells burst in the air at exactly the height needed to tear apart formations. Forests offered no cover. Foxholes became tombs. Night and fog, once trusted allies, turned meaningless. For those trapped beneath the airbursts, the battlefield felt less like war and more like a force of nature they were powerless to resist. Under this pressure, morale dissolved even among veteran units. Many surrendered at the first chance. Others broke and ran before American infantry ever arrived. In the aftermath, generals who had fought the entire war admitted the Ardennes revealed something deeper than tactical failure. It exposed a truth about the war Germany had never accepted. They were fighting nations whose scientific power, industrial organization, and logistical reach far outmatched anything the Reich could build. For every German tank destroyed, Americans produced 2 more. For every artillery piece lost, factories in the United States replaced it within days. Behind every American shell stood an industrial machine running at a scale the Germans simply could not imagine. Yet the proximity fuse was more than an industrial feat. It was the birth of an idea that reshaped warfare for generations. Weapons that could sense their environment and act on their own. That concept would lead directly to guided missiles, smart bombs, advanced radar systems, and the precision warfare of the modern age. Scientists who worked on the fuse later contributed to satellites, space exploration, Cold War defense systems, and electronics that eventually shaped the civilian world. For the soldiers in the Ardennes, though, the meaning was immediate and personal. The fuse helped shorten the war. It saved towns from being overrun, saved Allied divisions from collapse, and prevented a German breakthrough that might have prolonged the fighting deep into 1945. And each day the war was shortened meant fewer executions in concentration camps, fewer civilians caught in bombing raids, fewer soldiers dying on every front. The grim truth of total war was that a devastating weapon also preserved countless lives by accelerating the end. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25th, Germany's fate was sealed. Their last reserves were gone, their offensive power broken, and their armies forced into permanent retreat. The proximity fuse hadn't won the war alone, but it had ensured the Allies would never again lose the initiative. It symbolized the triumph of scientific innovation over brute force, and the moment technology fully entered the heart of modern combat. As winter faded and the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, the men who fought in the Bulge carried lasting memories of those airbursts, white flashes in freezing skies, splinters raining through the trees, the unnerving sense that the artillery always knew where they were. The German army left the Ardennes not just defeated but transformed, stripped of the belief that courage and training alone could overcome a world where technology now decided battles. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized decision on December 16th to the final retreat in late January, the proximity fuse proved what would define warfare for the next century. The side that mastered science would shape the battlefield. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, a small radar device rewrote the rules of war, marked the beginning of the technological era, and showed that in modern conflict, the greatest weapon is the one the enemy never saw coming until it was already too late.